today I want to talk a little bit about empathy. Kate Willett is a comedian who has been on my quiz show, Quiz-o-tron. She's an all-around smart and wonderful person, and she just wrote an article for Elle about how she used to hate Bernie bros, but then ended up dating one who then died in part due to a lack of affordable health care. Now she is an enthusiastic supporter of Bernie Sanders and single-payer healthcare. It's a great and truly touching article that I encourage you to read. I'm very glad she wrote it. In the past few years, this narrative has become more and more common, at least in my experience, hearing these stories of people who didn't care about a particular issue or who had a completely boneheaded take on an issue until it affected them personally and severely. All of those people, for instance, who supported Donald Trump's election in 2016, who are now being deported, or whose businesses are failing, or who are being left bankrupt or imprisoned from unexpected medical bills, who now say, oh, I get it, Trump is garbage and I'm not going to support him in the future. And we tend to celebrate these stories because someone changing their mind in the face of new information, someone who changes their mind to be more compassionate, that should be celebrated. Lots of people don't change their mind. No one is born knowing exactly the right thing to say or do or believe. It's a process that involves changing our minds. But it kind of makes me angry. Here's why. Humans do not need to experience everything directly in order to have enough of an understanding about it to make smart decisions. We, along with other of our brighter animal companions, have developed a system of communication that allows us to learn from one another so long as we are open to it. For instance, you don't have to eat that bright red mushroom to figure out whether or not it's going to kill you, because other people in the past have eaten it, and someone who saw that happen survived and told their friends the story of their boneheaded cousin who died shitting their organs out painfully after eating the pretty mushroom. Somehow, we have no trouble understanding how these stories benefit us here in the present day. But we, as a society, do not carry that thinking to its logical conclusion. Stories are the only way that we can quickly understand the world and the humans in it, even when we can't experience it directly. I don't have to lose a loved one to the broken American healthcare system to know that it's bad, because I've read stories like Kate Willett's. I've read stories about people who have starved on the street, stories about slaves, stories about trans people. These stories make me a better, more empathetic person than I otherwise would be, even though I will never, and in some cases can never, experience those things directly. This is all just a long-winded way for me to say this. Read more books. A recent Pew poll came out in September, found that 27% of American adults did not read a single book in the previous year. I'm not just guessing that that's a bad thing and that reading genuinely makes you a better person. The research suggests that that is true. Specifically, research shows that reading more literary fiction might make you a more empathetic person. Back in 2013, social psychologists gave people passages to read that were either nonfiction, literary fiction, or genre fiction. So it's things like science fiction or mystery. Another group got nothing to read. Sorry, suckers. Afterwards, the subjects all took a test that measured their ability to understand other people's feelings. And the literary fiction group was the only group to have a significant boost to their empathy. They followed this test up a few years later with another in which they had subjects mark down the names of authors that they're familiar with. Those who were familiar with literary fiction authors, as opposed to just knowing famous genre authors like Stephen King, did better on tests of empathy. The researchers suspect that literary fiction, unlike nonfiction or some genre fiction, challenges readers to dig into the characters' mindsets and to truly understand why those characters think and act the way they do. As a fan of some genre fiction, I initially bristled a little bit at this differentiation. One of my favorite writers, for instance, Kurt Vonnegut, hated the idea that science fiction should be relegated to a different shelf in the library just because of the occasional character built in another galaxy. It's hard to distinguish between quote-unquote good and bad literature or serious and frivolous literature. But just because these things exist on a spectrum doesn't mean that we can't point to the extreme ends and look at the differences between them. That's what's known as the Spectrum Fallacy, by the way. Like, yes, Slaughterhouse-5 is science fiction, but so is Day of the Moron by H. Beam Piper, and it is not good. So there are differences within a single genre, but in general, you can see a difference where at one end of the spectrum, a lot of genre novels are more based on the plot being driven forward. Who's the murderer? Where did those aliens come from? As opposed to being character driven. I've had many fights with my nerd friends about this. Simply reading isn't in and of itself a moral act of self-improvement. You have to read things that challenge you in order for that to happen. And this research backs that up. By the way, apologies to my patrons if you're finding this all familiar. It's because I did talk about this off the cuff in one of my Patreon vlogs a few months back. And I finally decided to turn it into a real video and probably get some angry messages. And I'm going to go another step further and say that watching films and television shows and playing video games can also make you a more empathetic person, and more people should do it. Because there's nothing particularly special about reading words on a page. Just like there's no real difference between reading words on a page and listening to the audiobook. Like, obviously there's a difference, but is one morally superior to the other? We're talking about stories and how stories can make us more empathetic, not just reading words on a page. So, again, I think it's not simply a matter of just mindlessly consuming media. A James Bond movie might have a fun, action-oriented plot, but you won't come away knowing more about the human condition because you really identified with Octopussy or whoever. But I came away from The Irishman, for instance, with a more interesting understanding of human mortality and aging and forgiveness. I might not learn much from rewatching Cheers for the 100th time, but watching The Good Place got me thinking more about philosophy than when I was actually in college philosophy classes. And I don't learn shit about shit while playing Overwatch, except for how to mute teenagers on voice chat. But I learned something about being a queer teenager in Gone Home. I'm not saying it's bad to enjoy Octopussy or Cheers or Overwatch or the latest young adult dystopia novel series. We all need brain vacations. But I really wish that we as a society all agreed that we should challenge ourselves with media, books, TV shows, movies, games that expand our horizons. Media that makes us better people by teaching us how to inhabit mindsets other than our own. I think we need to encourage each other in the way that I'm trying to do in this video, and also build up kids to be voracious, critical readers and watchers and gamers, to the point where they can hold on to that as they move into adulthood. Because I know a lot of people get out of high school and they're like, great, no more reading for me. And that's a terrible mindset, because we should all continue learning for our entire lives. And this one particular way of learning, of reading literary fiction, could make you a better person, a more social person, a more empathetic person. If you want to know what I'm reading this year, I've decided to get back to reviewing the books that I'm reading over on Goodreads. For my patrons, I have been mentioning in my weekly vlogs what sort of stuff that I'm consuming. So I'm going to continue doing that. And if you would like to get in on it, head over to patreon.com/Rebecca. Anybody that pledges $3 or more gets the weekly vlogs. But more importantly, please just, if this resonated with you at all, if you want to be a better and more empathetic person, maybe make an effort to not be part of that 27% this year. Read a book. Be more empathetic. Oh, and like Kate Willett says, vote for progressive politicians who will institute single-payer healthcare.